Did the police in the reckless Ben Bricks and Minifig story intentionally trick their dog into giving a false positive to enable a search on the vehicle Ben and his team were in? It's a question that has far more credibility than you might imagine. If you follow the story, you know that police allegedly received a tip that Ben's group was in possession of illegal substances, but that isn't enough for them to be able to legally demand to search the vehicle. That's why they bring the dog in to manufacture probable cause to violate Ben's Fourth Amendment rights. That's a familiar story and one that isn't unique to Ben and his crew by any means. It happens all the time throughout the country. However, what you may not notice is the way that a handler can intentionally trigger their dog to give a false alert. If you're skeptical of the premise, be sure to watch to the end. You won't be by the time this video concludes. The search begins, and we see here the handler blatantly tugs on the leash to try to get the dog to spend extra time at the trunk, but the dog doesn't show much interest. Probably because there aren't any drugs in there. The dog seems to remember that pull as it jumps on the car the next time it returns to that spot. Unfortunately for the officer, the dog doesn't give him the signal that will constitute probable cause, so he'll have to try this tactic again elsewhere. He passes the passenger side window, but quickly guides the dog back there, where he offers a more subtle tug. It's a little harder to see, so I'll slow it down, but if you look closely, you can see the tension on the lead as the handler tries to stop the dog at the passenger side window. The dog responds to this by looking at the window, at which point the handler brings his hand closer to the dog, which releases the tension on the leash and thus sends the message to the dog that it's doing the right thing. The dog doesn't actually detect anything anyway, so it keeps moving, but the next time the dog is brought back to the window, it then jumps up, repeating the pattern of the first time when it got pulled by the trunk. This time, however, the dog sits for about a second, which is long enough for the handler to allege that the dog has signaled the presence of drugs, and thus they have probable cause to violate Reckless Ben's Fourth Amendment rights. Good work, cops. The officer conducts a full-body pat-down of Ben before moving to the vehicle. He begins the search, but then quickly stops and pulls back to mute his body cam. Moments after he's done searching, he unmutes. One can't help but wonder what he was anticipating saying that he wouldn't want us to hear, but they search the vehicle for roughly 20 minutes before giving up, ultimately finding nothing. Now, if your drug-sniffing dog tells you there's drugs in the car and it turns out there's no drugs in the car, you don't have a drug-sniffing dog. You just have a dog. We learn in the footage that the dog's name is Bane, which I'll say is an odd choice when you're a police department to name your dog after a literal comic book villain. You're supposed to be on the side of justice and all. Just seems a little counterintuitive. It goes without saying none of this is the dog's fault, but I guess I'll say it anyway. A 2011 Chicago Tribune article on the subject affirmed the ability for handlers to cue dogs to give off alerts, even potentially unwittingly. They cited two members of Auburn University's Detector Dog Research Program, whose comments suggested that a handler's belief that drugs are present can cause them to signal to the dog through their body language, causing a false positive. If they can do it by accident, they obviously can do it intentionally. Now, I can't say for sure that any of this behavior was intentional, but given the lengths we've seen these officers go to cause trouble for Ben, it's a very understandable conclusion for one to draw. That same article showed that only 44% of police dog alerts actually resulted in officers finding drugs when they searched. That number plummeted even lower, dropping down to just 27% in instances where the driver of the vehicle was Hispanic. This is notable because it would suggest that there's a bias in these searches, and somehow I don't think that bias is coming from the dog. Now, this study was localized in Chicago, but other studies have that number falling even lower, including an Australian study that had it as low as 20%. Multiple other studies have proven similar rates within those ranges. To take this a step farther, Animal Cognition, a peer-reviewed scientific journal, released a study in which they had 18 handlers with their dogs go through rooms in which no drugs were present. The handlers were told that certain locations did, in fact, contain hidden drugs, and every single team, except for one, produced positive alerts to substances that simply weren't there. In fact, across a total of 144 searches, 225 false alerts were made. You might notice that second number is bigger than the first. Crucially, the locations which contained a heavy concentration of the false alerts were the same locations at which the handlers themselves were made to believe contained the paraphernalia, displaying a clear link between the handler's beliefs and the dog's alerts. A police dog in Washington passed its training with 100% accuracy, only to end up alerting his handler to the presence of drugs every single time he was brought out into the field, with drugs only actually be found in just 29% of those instances. Given how deeply flawed the process is, it seems pretty clear that the drug-sniffing dog is largely just a tool the police use as an excuse to violate your constitutional rights. Finally, it's worth noting that the Supreme Court has drawn a distinction between a drug-sniffing dog walking around the outside of the vehicle versus breaching the interior, with the latter not being allowed without a warrant or a previously established probable cause. As you can see in the video, the dog does stick his head inside of the vehicle just prior to giving the alert. Now, that doesn't immediately invalidate the alert, as courts may still allow it if they determine the dog is behaving on instinct without encouragement or deliberate manipulation by the officer. But what if there is encouragement or deliberate manipulation? Well, then that would be a violation of the Fourth Amendment. That's no good. But you know what is good? Liking and subscribing, or whatever. I don't know, man. The difficult part here, of course, is determining whether or not the officer acted with any intent here. Now that you understand a little bit more about the psychology behind this and the studies that have been done, let's take another look at the video footage and try to get an idea of what exactly happened here. So the dog ended up doing about 3 laps around this thing. This is the first time they reached the trunk, and you see the pull to get back to the trunk to spend a little extra time. Doesn't find anything. They keep moving. Next time they go to that trunk, the dog jumps. Could that be a coincidence? Sure. However, the next clear pull is going to be right here after the dog is guided back to the front. And again, we slowed this one down earlier. You could kind of see the tension on the leash. It's a little more subtle. It's just a little bit of a nudge. It gets the dog to look back up at the window, and the next time the dog comes around to that window, we're in there. I can't say for sure that this was done with malice, but I certainly have questions. I'll drop some links in the description if you wanted to go through those studies yourself, but based on what we know, it seems there's really only a few possibilities at play here. One is that this is a previously trained behavior, which would obviously be the most scandalous option. Two is that the dog is picking up on signals the handler may not even be aware that they're putting out, though the pull by the trunk was a pretty blatant attempt to get the dog to spend extra time there. Three is that this is genuinely standard police work and there's nothing to see here. Much like in the case of the previously discussed study, it seems incredibly unlikely that it's a coincidence that the spots that the dog showed more attention to are also the spots in which the officer seemed to anticipate a positive alert, indicated by what appears to be an attempt to get the dog to spend extra time in those spots. This is especially noteworthy considering the dog hadn't shown much interest prior to the officer's actions. In this explanation, it's plausible that the handler isn't even aware of the ways that they're influencing the search. The most generous interpretation seems to be one of incompetence on the part of the handler. Dogs are extremely good at reading humans, so it's crucial that the handler is cognizant of their biases and makes sure to attempt to approach the search with an awareness of how their behavior will be read by the canine. Regardless of if the dogs are good at detecting, the studies make it pretty clear that the humans are bad at not influencing the search. The only question is whether or not it's intentional. When so many other instances of wrongdoing exist within this case, it's difficult to give the benefit of the doubt, but the line between malice and incompetence tends to get very blurry when it comes to police corruption, and that blur is likely very intentional. An NPR article about the aforementioned study cites Gunnar Fulmer, a canine officer in Washington, who acknowledged that, and I quote, "The dogs are mainly used to confirm what we already suspect. When the dogs come out, about 99% of the time, we get an alert, and it's because we already know what's in the car. We just need that confirmation to help us out with that." The article doesn't cite what percent of that 99 actually turns up with anything, though Fulmer admits that there's been cars that his dog has hit on that didn't turn up any illegal substances. That isn't to say that every single officer must share the same mindset as Fulmer, but it's a bit stunning to hear an officer just brazenly admit it. At least in his methods, he's not looking for additional information, he's just looking to confirm his pre-existing biases and is utilizing his dog as a means to circumvent the suspect's constitutional rights. It's the kind of thing that someone might suggest conspiratorially, except in this instance, he's just kind of voluntarily admitting it. Speaking of voluntary admissions, I'd like to remind you that you have the right to remain silent and you should probably exercise it when in doubt. Obviously, I'm not suggesting you should be actively combative if you find yourself in a similar situation to Ben, but you should remember that the cops are not only allowed to lie to you, they may be actively encouraged to do so. The one thing that they aren't allowed to lie to you about is your constitutional rights. So when a cop gives you an order, you might want to consider asking them if you're legally compelled to follow said order or answer whatever questions they have. Ben made the mistake of repeatedly talking to the cops without a lawyer present on several occasions, and it's likely to make his case a little trickier than it needs to be for himself, even though it does seem to have helped expose some corruption. One aspect in which Ben and his crew were very smart about is not initially consenting to the search of the vehicle prior to the dog's arrival. Once the dog arrives, there really isn't much you can do, but prior to the dog's arrival, you aren't compelled to oblige without some kind of prior warrant or probable cause, and they aren't allowed to lie about having that, so you should be sure to ask. Now, disclaimer that I am not a lawyer, but I really encourage you to read up on your rights. Far too many people incriminate themselves when they simply don't have to. Watch my other videos. Or don't. It's your life. You're not legally compelled to watch them. What you do with your time is between you and the police dog who takes away your rights.